ASMR artists' editing process, ideas process, whatever it happens to be, or just like how they film, or things like that. I find that kind of thing, I don't know, feels like I know the person a little bit more, kind of seeing how everything gets made, or something like that, but it's also just because I'm nosy. I am quite nosy. I've recently not been propping up the laptop. This kind of limits what you can see plant-wise, but, I don't know, I almost kind of like the slightly lifted perspective, but if anybody is not enjoying it, please let me know. I can easily start propping things back up. Literally the only reason why I stopped propping things up is because I put the books away, which was good, because less clutter. I mean, like, I sit on an end table. Some of you know this. If you've been around for a long time, you know this. Right now I'm sitting on an end table, but, like, not my nightstand, but, like, an extra end table that I've had in my room for, like, years upon years upon years. But, like, in and around here, like, here is where I have, like, here is where I have all of my cords, like, my phone charger and shit like that. And then here's my nightstand, like, right here, where you usually will see the Hawaiian palm. Here's my end table, but there's, like, a gap right here, kind of, like, back from where the cords are, that just gets so cluttered. So I can start popping up the camera again if we need that. Plus I also kind of like that a little bit better, mostly because I'm sort of, I have trouble looking directly at the camera, but I try to create the illusion of that as much as I can. In this, I feel like you can kind of see that I'm slightly looking downward and then kind of all around. Anyway, that is not what we are here to talk about. We are here to talk about this wonderful book. I'm doing a book review. Now, I have contemplated expanding my book reviews not just to the book that I read about once a month. For those of you who do not know, I read about one book a month. That's the pace that I can manage, mostly because it's very difficult to keep my attention for long stretches of time. So sometimes, every now and again, sometimes it's a chapter per day. Sometimes I go on a spree, but usually it's a chapter per day. So I usually manage about 12 books a year, slightly less than that, but all things considered, it's about a book a month. And I have considered expanding out my book content, mostly because I have found it very fun to talk about my books. The other thing that could possibly happen is once I get a Blue Yeti microphone, it does intrigue me to possibly do like a book channel. I know usually when people on YouTube create a second channel, that second channel is sometimes a lost cause. And I also don't need more work on my plate, but it would likely just be a video of a month, if that. And they would probably not be ASMR, just because, I don't know. Like, it's hard to whisper all of my thoughts about books. Well, it's not hard to whisper all of my thoughts about books, but, like, I feel like if I'm doing a dedicated book channel, the overlap between book YouTube and ASMR YouTube is probably larger than other overlaps, but I feel like it would be fun to just talk as myself, and then you would all have to hear the hideous, disgusting, real voice that I have, that I don't know if I will ever reveal honestly feels like I'm reading nonfiction. It is so gorgeously written, with such a attention to detail that I find so it is fully immersive, because I don't know, like generally I am pretty good at buying in. I am very good at suspension of disbelief. I can read some pretty whack shit and be on board, I would say. But like this book, I don't even have to do that. This is set in a universe that is way different, and very alien from the one that we live in, obviously, because this is a universe in which a galactic council is a thing, and alien races have been sort of, it reminds me of a Mass Effect without the Reapers kind of thing, where humanity is kind of late to the party. There's already been, like, centuries worth of history on a galactic scale, that humans are kind of just now, been party to within the last century kind of thing. So there is that, and there's lots of different words, and there's different terminology, but the way that Becky writes this world is so immersive that you feel like a resident of this universe. Everything is so elegantly explained that it really doesn't feel like you have to enter the world. It almost feels like this is a text from your own history or something. It's so weird, especially because, like, the framing of this is each chapter is told from the perspective of a certain person, and there are, I believe, five parts to the book. Five parts to the book. Oh my god. There are 7 parts to the book. So there are 7 here. I'm just going to block off just in case you want to read it, but this is part 7, which is and will undying and will undying. That's part 7. And there are 5 parts before, or there are 6 parts before that. My god, math. So that is essentially how things are told. It's told in parts, and each of these parts has, I would say, a specific set of themes, but it's all through lines. They all connect. And then each little chapter is told from the perspective of somebody. You could say that it kind of is a chapterless system, and it's just told in the 7 parts, with each of the 7 parts being handled elegantly with these perspective switches. But I would go so far as to call them chapters, just because I think that each of the characters' storylines are separate enough that those divisions are useful. It's not like The Spear Cuts Through Water, where everything just kind of fits and flows so gorgeously and elegantly. This is broken up between the people's perspectives, and that's not to say that this isn't written elegantly. I find this to be written was an archivist named Isabel, and this is where I kind of have to tell you a lot of information for you to understand what's going on. Essentially, the Cliff's Notes, and I am summarizing a lot here, the Cliff's Notes is that many, many, many centuries before this book, Earth and humans sort of continued on killing the planet. We created such a climate disaster that Earth, for at least large-scale human habitation, would be, it wouldn't have been possible. So, what the humans eventually ended up doing is they ended up building these gigantic factories, and they just started dismantling their own cities. They started dismantling cities. They started melting buildings down. They would dismantle buildings and melt them down in these giant factories in the service of creating these massive colony ships, essentially these massive arcs, basically. If we're thinking about it in terms of like a ship that was meant to carry as many humans as possible, each ship, I believe, ends up carrying about 1.3 million people or something like that, which, of course, if we think of our own population numbers, is kind of horrific. But it was an incredibly desperate effort, and we kind of get the sense that due to climate disaster and large-scale social upheaval and a rise in authoritarianism, followed very quickly by a dismantling of that authoritarianism on a worldwide scale, led to a huge amount of deaths and a huge sort of like basically worldwide famine conditions, because farming eventually became something so difficult that it could not sustain a small city. So we have a situation where these humans have realized, holy shit, this is done. So at the point of, we need to get out of here, they build these foundries, they dismantle everything. Nothing is left to chance. They take everything with them. They start mining, they start absolutely gutting the planet, more so than we already do. Or more so than they already have done, but we do this already. So you can see how this is very believable, it's very plausible. But anyway, essentially, they then were able to build a bunch of these massive ships that they call homesteaders, and they essentially just set off for wherever, and like to find a new planet. Essentially, that was their mission, so they set off into deep space. They don't have the ability to travel faster than light. They just set off on a massive migration. And I believe it ends up being around 36 million people that make it into this fleet that is leaving Earth. And these people call themselves Exodan, E-X-O-D-A-N, referencing Exodus, or making an exodus. They are Exodan. It's not referencing the Bible, but that's just where we sort of get the idea of Exodus from. Anyway, so that is one facet of human society. There is another sort of offshoot of humans that we never hear population numbers on, but there is implied to be large-scale settlement of Mars, and there is large-scale settlement of sort of the outer moon, the moons of the outer planets, and then the moon, like our moon right now, is settled as well. So there are also like humans who still live in the solar system, and there's quite a bit of tension between them and the Exodans. It's sort of implied to almost be like a sort of quasi-moral kind of thing, because it sounds like Mars and a lot of the human societies that stayed within the solar system kept a lot of the trappings of earthen life, like currency, like warfare, like class division, and that kind of thing. So the Exodans, though, they do away with this. They create what is essentially it is an economy that is founded on bartering. It is like you still create things, and you use those things that you create to barter for the things that other people create, but it is essentially a sort of a neo-communistic. It's really interesting, and that's kind of where else I like the book, and we'll talk about that later. But knowing a lot of this history, when the Exodus fleet finally did make contact with the aliens, it was a long and tricky process to become accepted by the galactic community, which is sort of the United Nations of the galaxy. And then eventually the humans get acceptance into the galactic community after a lot of sort of racism and skepticism towards humanity. And then finally, humanity is given a star for the Exodus fleet to orbit around. And then contact is made with the Martians and the humans that live around the solar system, and humanity is sort of as fully as a species is brought in to the fold of the galactic community. There's also this really very interesting sect of people called Gaiists, Gaiists, and they are people who believe that Earth has always been the homeland for humans, that you would become sick if you don't go to Earth. So they sort of try to brave it out in the extremes of the destroyed Earth and environment. So it's such a rich world, and I get all of this based on a couple of sentences. Becky Chambers is a masterful author in getting information across without feeling like you have to read the entire history of a people. It's so good, and it's so human. The history of this people is told from such a human lens, and we get to see what Exodan society looks like from the eyes of somebody who cares for the dead, and how they do their whole thing. You get to see it through the eyes of a sex worker. You get to see it through the eyes of an archivist. You get to see it through the eyes of a teenager. You get to see it through the eyes of a shuttle bay worker. You get to see it through the eyes of a salvage team and an immigrant to the fleet, a human who usually lives sort of on the planets that are governed by the other alien races that has actually gone back to the Exodus fleet to see what life is like there, because he doesn't feel like he's accepted in the other sort of parts of the galaxy. But anyway, so knowing all of this, Isabel, one of the characters, is an archivist. She is very, very old, and she is sort of like a reservoir of knowledge, and she is essentially the sort of excuse for the framing device, where she is hosting an alien that goes by the name of Gahololan. Yep, Gahololan. Ghuh''Lolan. Gahololan. Gahololan. Very interesting. And Gahololan is a Harmangian. And if you can get some context for what a Harmangian is essentially a gelatinous blob that requires water to survive, with like tentacles and eye stalks and things like that. But I think the most interesting thing is that the Harmangians were actually at one point the sort of a galactic oppressor that had to have been overthrown so that the galactic community could be established. So you're seeing this researcher who researches alien cultures coming to the Exodus fleet from one of the most wealthy and powerful races in the galaxy to the most poor and destitute race in the galaxy. Very, very interesting. And, like, the fact, oh god, it's so good. You need to read this book. It's so fucking good. And, like, I am kind of spoiling a little bit of it because the fun of this book is sort of understanding where human society has sort of arrived at in the wake of losing our planet because we killed it. So I am spoiling it in that sense. There's not a huge deal of like world-ending plot and stakes and things like this, but there doesn't need to be, because I would say that this book is essentially a philosophy book. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story at the beginning of each of the parts, Guhululolin is writing back to her research institute, essentially she's on a fact-finding mission. How do humans live in the Exodus fleet? What are their cultures? What are their traditions? What is their history? And Isabel is the host for that. And then the other thing that has happened about 20 years ago, no, not 20 years ago, 15, or no, Kip is 16. How long ago did it happen? Oh god. Come on. Because there's Tessa, with the exception of the prologue. For standards earlier, and I believe a standard is a period of 306 days or 310 days. You don't get a clear answer, but it doesn't really matter because that is essentially what a year is. It's called Eclectic standard. So 4 years ago, one of the homesteaders in a shuttle accident was blown wide open, and that was sort of the most catastrophic thing to ever happen to the Exodus fleet, other than having to leave their home planet. So that is sort of the framing that we receive, where this giant disaster has happened to a ship called the Oxymoko or the Ohomoko, and that's what I read to all of you when I started this book on the channel. And so then we jump forward 4 standards and find how all of our characters are sort of living and dealing and all that kind of thing. So basically, we are introduced to the Exodus fleet with Guhululolin, and then through all of the rest of the POV characters. The characters are so well written. There's not a ton of like growth, but there doesn't need to be, because like I said, this is essentially a philosophy book that is told through 4 or 5 intimate character stories, and we see sort of the evolution of these people and how they deal with life in such a sort of difficult but very easy system to live within. It's so fascinating, and that is sort of how we read this book. And the book is broken up into those parts because I think each part is meant to show us a different facet and is meant to ask different questions that sort of build on each other as they go. And that's where I get into the philosophy angle of things, because I believe that this book, more than being a story and plot-driven novel, is a work of philosophy. I believe that this book is seeking to ask questions and attempt to think of answers for those questions. us to flee our homes? What would I do? How would I adjust? What would life look like for me? And in that, I think there's almost a little bit of, if somebody moves to a different city away from their family, I think there are truths to be found within this book. That sort of figuring out of things when you move away is explored in this book. But you are along the ride with around 30 million other humans figuring out what that looks like and what it has looked like. We see their death traditions, we see their birth traditions, we see how they farm, we see how they cycle oxygen, we see how they deal with disaster, we see how they divide their labor, we see how they educate their people, we see how sex is evolved in this society, we see how gender has evolved and identity has evolved, we see how just war and currency and like all of these things are finite institutions that we just think of as infinite because we have short lifespans. But this book dares to ask so many questions, and the way that I like to define philosophy is the practice of asking certain questions about the nature of humanity, the nature of life, and the nature of the universe, and then attempting to answer those questions somehow, usually through thought or writing. And I would say that this is one of the most interesting works of philosophy ever written, because it's told in a science fiction story, and the questions it's asking are not immediately relevant to life on Earth today, but they are questions we should be asking, because this is not only a hopeful vision for what would happen if we kill our planet, but it's also a hopeful vision if we were to abolish the idea of markets and currency and capital. This, I would say, is a work of at least communist adjacent theory. This is also a work, I would say, that posits questions about what would happen to human biology and why would we, how would we design our lives to be able to live on ships and keep people healthy physically and mentally for a potentially centuries-long journey. And it is just, if it also poses questions like what would happen if the way that we approach labor was fundamentally different? What if we approached commerce in a way that was fundamentally different? If we abolished currency and we brought a bartering system in and we essentially operated just on trade, and how that incentivizes artists and as well as like dock workers and shit like that. I think it's just such a beautifully succinct book, and I think nowhere is that more interesting to me than in one of the women in this book is named Eyas, E-Y-A-S, and she seeks out the company of a sex worker, and he is eventually becomes a good friend of hers. But I think the questions that are asked so provocatively and interestingly in the approach to that sex work, and how that provides such an essential service to society, in a society that changes so much from the one that we know today, and how that fits in. I don't know, like, this book is so good. If I had thought to, I probably would have ended up earmarking pages with with those little sticky tabs, annotating, I guess is the word. But there were many moments where I would be like, this is your book. This book is inherently not. It is not a political book. It does not make any sweeping statements or anything like that, but it just prompts thought, and it asks the question, what if we could be different? And then it answers with that. And then it answers that question. We can be different. Here's how it could look. It's not perfect, but I don't know, it's gorgeous. There is so much going on in this book. Becky Chambers always writes a book that makes you think, always writes a book that makes you feel and ponder, and there have been many moments in Becky Chambers' books where I have done that motion of, okay, and then had to think about it for a little while. This book is a masterpiece. Record of a Spaceborn Feel by Becky Chambers. Go purchase this book. If you cannot, I totally understand. I am not going to pressure you into buying it, of course. This, if you find it